This episode of the BeanCast is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you advertise on LinkedIn, you can build lasting relationships with customers that often translate to high-quality leads, website traffic, and higher brand awareness. For a free $100 LinkedIn ad credit, go to linkedin.com/BeanCast. Terms and conditions apply. Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Transcription services provided by transcribeme.com. Visit them on the web at transcribeme.com/BeanCast for up to 25% off. That's transcribeme.com. Episode 511, FOMO for Millennials. For Monday, September 10th, 2018, it's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norton. Thanks for joining us. Why do so many brands, even wildly successful brands, lose momentum over time? Markets evolve, of course, and brands must work to stay relevant in the midst of changing needs, but are there even greater forces at work? Tonight, we'll discuss. Also, why small markets are capturing more A-list talent, the continuing dilemma over SAG-AFTRA contracts, harnessing millennial FOMO, plus this week's Ad Fail 5. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the president at Arcadia Media Lab, author, speaker, Mr. Jonathan Salem Baskin is here. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Bob. Great to be back on the show.
Always glad to have you on the program, man. Now, also joining us once again, we have the CEO and chairman of Streamlined Media, Mr. Darren Wesley Martin Jr. is here. Hi, Darren.
Hey, Bob. Good to be back on the show. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And finally, we have the recently installed editor-in-chief of the Clios and their online magazine Muse by Clio, Mr. Tim Nudd joins us. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having me back on.
Glad that you can make it, especially given your many, many responsibilities now that you took on this new job. But
I'm happy to be here on a Sunday evening.
Well, pleased to have you all on the program, and let's jump right into the topics. First up, there was an interesting thought piece on Media Post over our break that looked at why so many brands get less effective over time. Now, the article makes a lot of great points, but most notably for me was that strong brands don't rely on what they are today, but rather push for what they will be tomorrow. Now, Jonathan, is this universally true? Because everybody I know always relies on brand heritage and the history of our brand, and it seems like brand heritage could get a lot of brands in trouble if they rely on it too heavily. What's your thoughts on this?
You know, it's funny to be able to riff on this, Bob, considering, as you know, I'm the guy who wrote the book Branding Only Works on Cattle. So I do have a pretty strong opinion about this. So I think it's interesting because both qualities matter, right? I mean, brands exist to be reliable identifiers of everything from quality to performance and everything in between and value. But this idea that they also have to anticipate and promise a future benefit, even if that benefit isn't 100% clear, I think is absolutely true these days. I think there's a shift toward interest in novelty and a desire for innovation and change, even sometimes just for the sake of innovation and change. So I think the challenge for brands is not so much to be just forward-looking, but really to bridge that idea of why are we the ones looking forward and why should we be the ones for you? It was interesting that story that you quote had the guy who wrote it was quoting Jobs talking about Henry Ford saying, if we asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. I worked with Steve Jobs on the iMac launch, and it was interesting. We talked so much during those days. Granted, they were back in the ancient 1990s, but we talked so much about not knowing exactly what people would do with this device, this machine that we were building that looked like a giant, translucent teardrop. And a real motivating factor for us was not so much that you could rely on it to do XYZ, but you could rely on Apple giving you the chance to do something new because that's what we were about. And to my point about bridging why us and why the brand is about that past heritage, but the challenge is how do you deliver that as sort of the credibility for what you're proposing for the future and not knowing. And just a quick add there, just like the iPad, to jump ahead in Apple history, I don't know if it's so much giving people stuff they don't know they wanted. I think it's giving people stuff that enables them to discover needs of themselves and then new needs. There was airplane pilots weren't sitting around complaining that clipboards and pen and paper were ineffective for keeping track of maintenance checklists. It's just when they were presented with an iPad, it revolutionized how they thought about it. So it wasn't so much a need they had. It was a new opportunity, and that's the whole point of innovation.
It sounds.
I'm kind of riffing, but that's what I think.
You're doing a great job, and you've set it up really, really well. For me, when I listen to you talk, I'm less thinking that this is about trying to evolve what the brand means to reflect what the customer needs, and more about most companies are too caught up in that in terms of their brand, instead of trying to think through what the brand means at a higher level. Because Apple, like you say, is very much focused on innovation, on being ahead of the curve. It's built into their DNA about who they are, that they're going to surprise us. I mean, they may not have always done a good job of it, but they're working toward that. Amazon, it's more about this idea of, everything that you can imagine being available to you immediately. IBM, it's just like they've evolved so many times, but they still remain this thought leader on the computer generation, on the business world. They basically make business easier. You're never going to get fired for buying into IBM. It still applies even today. And I wonder if part of the problem, guys, is that brands think too small when they brand their company or brand their product, and they're not really thinking through how this brand survives over time and how it evolves into new markets. Is that part of the issue at play?
Can I just quickly add, and guys then jump in, but absolutely. And let's bring it down to earth and talk about toothpaste. So, you have a brand management system that says the opportunity for toothpaste differentiation is to create 45 different versions of toothpaste. And I'll leave all the names of the products out, but I think just your point, Bob, that idea of the brand folks thinking about how to sort of slice and dice present state instead of looking at how to innovate future state, because you could argue that the toothpaste brand shouldn't just be figuring out how to highlight its whitening capability or prowess to reduce cavities, but in fact innovate and change the way we think about toothpaste or brushing our teeth. And we don't get that innovation in the consumer product space. We get the brand differentiation, I think, just what the article's author was talking about, which was how do you just sort of divvy up that extant consumer desire and try to get that extra dollar versus thinking about how do we fundamentally change this. And that's why we always default to talking about technology brands when we talk about innovation. But I when I was writing for Forbes, I wrote about Dove, and those folks think of themselves as a technology company, and it's possible. So I think this guy's right, but it's not about the brand folks slicing and dicing it. It's about the business innovating products and the marketers thinking about novel ways to communicate that. I don't know, guys.
And that always goes back to my ongoing complaint about branding. I think the branding belongs to the entire C-suite. It doesn't belong to the marketing folks. Marketing folks are responsible and tasked with communicating the brand, but they shouldn't be responsible for creating the brand. The brand itself belongs to the entire organization because every touch point is important. Tim, you have a unique perspective in that you worked at Ad Age and you've monitored the way that brands communicate. I was so happy that you weren't at Adweek anymore because I wasn't going to make that mistake anymore. And here I go right in the first minute saying the wrong thing. But yeah, you have this unique perspective being on the outside, monitoring brands for I think you were the editor of Ad Freak for a while, doing a lot of different exposés and thought pieces on the way that people branded. And now you're dealing with the best in creative at Clio. So what's your take on this? I mean, are brands not thinking deep enough about what they mean over time?
I think many of them don't. I think that's true. I hate to plug Muse right away here, but Ernie Schenk wrote a piece for me for Muse recently about how marketers should think about what they want to be in 100 years. And if you think about 100 years, there's no way you're thinking about how, the specifics of innovating or where you're going to tactically improve. You really have to think big about your brand. My example on this topic is actually from here in Portland, Maine. I moved up here to Portland in 2008, and there was really very, very few brewers here. There was one called Geary's and one called Shipyard, and they were pretty much it. And they had the majority of the market, very few challengers. But Geary's is an absolutely fantastic beer, but they didn't change at all. They didn't innovate at all. And very quickly they were overtaken. 10 years later, this brand that was the central brand in this market is very, very secondary. Portland's swarming with microbreweries. The energy is in all these new brands. And I think it's a perfect example of a brand that didn't really, just thought that its own quality would live on forever. And very rarely does that happen. And you look at the best marketers today, and they're always thinking a year or two ahead. We were talking before we came on about Nike. This Colin Kaepernick stuff has almost certainly been in the works for a year or more. I mean, this is a company that's been innovating what Just Do It means for 30 years, and it's a perfect example of how to think big and how to iterate differently around that big idea.
Darren, I want to talk more about management and understanding how people manage their brands, because obviously brand managers are not effectively managing this problem in many, many cases. Just because brands get tired over time doesn't mean that they can't evolve and they can't become something more relevant to the marketplace that they exist in today. And what are brand managers not doing enough of in order to anticipate this need and move the brand forward even before it becomes a problem or brand starts diminishing?
Bob, I think that's a great question, but I'd actually also add to that question if they're being empowered by the C-suite. You mentioned that before, right? Do they have the budgets? Do they have the capacity to think on that macro level when they have, goals to be met each quarter or each year? And everything is such a year by year basis. So when we think of business, we want to think 3 to 5 years out. But the reality is there's a lot of things that are happening that have affected in the past or in present that have the brand ambassadors, the brand managers, the C-suite just heads down, right? So if the brand managers don't have that space in which they are able to think outside the box and think long term and have their ideas invested in, then they could be thinking about it. I'm very sure they are thinking about it. But if they're not supported, then it's just thought, right? It's no action. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of larger brands, is that many of the managers are not moving faster than some of the brand ambassadors or brand managers or some of the junior level talent who wants to see a larger shift. And so because they're moving so slow, you're not seeing a large innovation or tactics that push them forward, right? It's the same thing that makes them money year over year, and really it's safe. What's safe and what makes money is what they're going to continue to go after, right? It's the idea why only 10% of the budget or so is put into experimentation, right? That entire thought process has to shift in order for their talent and their company to transform as well.
But that just talks, I mean, all of that makes sense, and all of that is makes some relevant points here. But that just addresses the marketing problem itself. I mean, that just deals with the situation with the communication part of the puzzle. What do brands need to do in order to infuse this presence, infuse this this brand into their very DNA, into their culture, so that they can evolve right from the point where a product is being developed to the point where it's being communicated. I mean, throughout the whole process.
Yes, I think that goes back to the C-suite, and it goes back to the executives who have to create culture and create a consensus around the product that they're actually selling, and build some type of connection and engagement with its employees so that they are connected to being innovative, that they feel like they can, open up and have different ideas around a product that is either old or new. So it is definitely still in the warehouse of the CEO, the chief talent officer, the CMO, to create a culture that speaks to their level and their values and their mission, and it's continuously reinforced to a level that people feel as if this is why I'm working here. To talk about Apple, when Jonathan brought it up, people, I'm very sure, felt empowered to be innovative, felt empowered to think about things that the consumer didn't know they wanted, right? And because of that, great products were created. So it definitely still is in the warehouse of the CEO, of the chief talent officers, of the CMO to fix that problem internally.
Well, and if I could add, and Darren, I think you're right. But I also think that it is sort of a Dr. Heal Thyself type problem as well, in that I think this idea that we as marketers, or the folks who are holding the brand even more specifically, are somehow separate from the rest of the business, or have this insight that the rest of the business doesn't have, to Bob's point earlier about it being about the operations and about every touch point. I think the problem, and again, back to this article that talked about brands losing value, it's all about the creations of marketers. It's all about the brand as this artificial construct that marketers have invented through their creative imagination. And I think to Tim's point about, for marketers to think about who they are going to be in 100 years, I think they're going to be out of a job. Because I think in a way we're sort of like, we function like the court alchemists in the 17th century. We're busy being responsible for and using our tools to create things that arguably are so much bigger and deeper and more nuanced and more meaningful than we could ever hope to imagine. And again, I love the Nike ad. I've spent my life doing and talking about marketing and branding, but I really think the other part of, in addition to the empowerment you're talking about, Darren, which again is spot on, I think is this idea of us reimagining what our role is. And it's not simply we don't own the brand. We don't create it. This idea that we're going to go make it through our creative imagination is nonsense.
Well,
if there's there is no brand. And I think the challenge for us is to go back into the organization, and instead of telling the organization what it should be, do a much better job of reflecting back to the internal audience and the external stakeholders who and what it is.
Well, when I'm thinking about this situation and what you're describing to me here, Jonathan, I really think that marketers are not going to go away, because I think marketers need to evolve into something more than what they are. And this goes back to Marketing 101. I mean, if you take a Marketing Management 101 class, a very basic class on how to market and how to deal with your product and how to bring it to market and how to deal with the communication parts of the puzzle, when you boil it all down, it's a value exchange. That's what marketing is. It's a value exchange. And value can be created in anywhere, from the product sourcing to the product development to the customer service. I mean, marketing is the entire process from conceptualization on forward. So why are we so focused on marketing being so concentrated on the message and the experience, as opposed to the entire process from the point where we think up something to the point where we sell it?
Well, I think you're proving you're agreeing with my point, Bob, which is I think marketing. Sergio Zeman used to say marketing's too important to be left to the marketers.
Right.
It ultimately is embedded in everything everybody does in the organization. So long term, this idea, the value that we as marketers create right now is still this funny sort of interstitial moment of technology and culture. We still hold some of the connector between the company and the world. But that's going away. Once we don't control that, again, I'm not trying to be dour about it, but I can't help but think that marketing and branding as a concept kind of goes the way of, insurance agents and travel agents. We don't need to broker what people think. What we do need to do is dive back into the organization and get everybody empowered to be and communicate what the company aspires and wants to be. And back to the point about this article, it is about bringing new things to the market, not just simply telling the market, here's what you asked for. I think so. In a way, I think marketing dies in 100 years. To Tim's time frame, but long live marketing.
Well, good points all. Good points all. And since you brought up Tim, I want to talk a little bit, shift this conversation and talk a little bit more about the possibilities of change and whether or not they're even realistic. Because it seems to me the process of brand evolution is speeding up as consumer attention becomes more fragmented. And we're being faced with an increasingly shorter cycle of brand relevance that needs to then evolve to meet the shifting consumer attention span. Is that problem going to continue to get worse? And if so, is it even possible for brands to live for a long time, or are they so disposable that they need to evolve to a peak and then just die and new brands replace them?
Well, I think certain brands are too big to fail, probably. At this point, I think that if you have a head start and you've got, all this consumer attention, you've got the, you've just got your presence that's been built up over many years. I think the smart marketers begin, they try to move at the speed that the culture is moving, and they try to get ahead of that curve too. You talk to some of the best CMOs out there, and they're thinking creatively about how to move as fast as they can in general. And, I think what you see tactically from a lot of brands is just trying to jump on trends because they think that is moving at the speed of culture. And I think, particularly the brands that jump on advertising trends, I think that once they've, once you jump on a trend, you've sort of lost the plot, and I think, I was at Clio Judging a few weeks back. I was talking to Fernando Machado about this, the Burger King CMO, and he's a guy who I'm always pretty impressed with. Who he's the stuff that they create is very trendy, and it trends all the time in social. But it's not, they create the trend usually, and I think that speed is very difficult for any brand to get to, and they have a very fascinating model over at Burger King that is, literally it's Fernando. He has a WhatsApp group with all of his agencies around the world, and like one person from each agency, and they're constantly chatting on this app, and the very format of their conversation is sort of futuristic, and that's the way they share ideas, and they have all these wonderful creatives that are contributing the craziest ideas they can come up with to this thing, and they end up with this dynamic process that moves very, very quickly. And I think the brands that tap into that are going to be the ones that can, I think, affect the culture and reflect, and even steer the culture, and give people these experiences that they didn't know they wanted, even as technology begins to, overtake our lives. And I think it's going to be very difficult for a lot of brands to do that, but I think you're seeing more and more brands that are starting to understand that, and I think that the younger folks that are working on these brands at a creative level are bringing their experiences as digital natives into this ecosystem, and it's not really that unusual for them to move that quickly. And I do think that when they apply their expertise on the brand level, that they could continue to build these things up, and I don't think they're going to collapse under their own weight necessarily. I think it's about speed.
Well, I think this is a fascinating subject, but we need to move on, and we're going to talk next about ad land migrating away from big cities. Seems to be a trend going on where more and more A-list talent are starting to explore opportunities in smaller markets. We'll discuss to see whether that's actually happening. But before we get to that, I do want to talk about our sponsor, LinkedIn. and your opportunity out there to get $100 ad credit. So listen through this ad because there's a shining light at the end of this tunnel, an opportunity to get $100 of ad credit to spend on their platform. Look, when you're trying to get to your customers, you need to find them where they're ready to make a decision. You need to find them where they're engaging with content every single day. You need to find them where they're actually thinking about the subjects that are matters to your business and to your particular product and to your particular campaign. What you need is laser focused targeting. And when you advertise on LinkedIn, which is the world's largest professional network, you're going to have the opportunity to build the kind of long-term relationships with your customers that you just can't build anywhere else. Because there's these relationships there that you can build that are translating into high-quality leads, website traffic, and higher brand awareness. Now, the focus here, the thing that you need to realize with LinkedIn is that you're talking to the right audience almost all the time. I mean, every day, over 500 million professionals engage with the content on LinkedIn, and chances are your future customers are going to be among them. Now, LinkedIn has the marketing tools that you need to help you target these people with precision, the kind of precision you just can't get at other platforms because they offer you the ability to target down to the job title, to the company name, to the industry. And because better targeting equals a message your customers care about, it's going to lead to the kind of trust that you build with your customers that you can't get when you're trying to just target them based on whether or not they're 35 years old or, live in San Diego. You're going to have the opportunity to get them where they live with a message that's completely relevant to them and to their business. And you're going to get them to trust you because 4 out of 5 customers who are on LinkedIn are decision makers at their companies. Let me repeat that. 4 out of 5 customers who are on LinkedIn are decision makers at their company. So you're building the kind of relationships you need with the people who really matter to your business. And to redeem your free $100 LinkedIn ad credit and launch your first campaign, I want you to go to this web address. Go to linkedin.com/BeanCast. That's linkedin.com/BeanCast for a free $100 ad credit. Now, terms and conditions apply. You'll find them on the site. But remember, LinkedIn is absolutely the best place to target your next campaign. They offer you the tools, they offer you the resources, and of course, they offer you the people who matter most to your business. So check it all out at linkedin.com/BeanCast. Get your $100 ad credit, and we thank them very much for their support of our program. Well, advertising agencies used to be things that lived and breathed mostly in big cities. Now, of course, there were always the off-market outliers like Martin in Richmond and Wieden+Kennedy in Portland, but the bigger cities always attracted the best talent and therefore delivered most of the good work. But now that talent pool is migrating to cities like Austin and Omaha and Kansas City, giving rise to bigger accounts heading to smaller markets. Darren, what is behind this shift, if it really is happening, and is it beneficial or problematic for the business world? What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for that question. It's so funny because one of our clients or hopeful clients at Bold, they're stationed in Kansas City, and they were actually talking about how they're trying to get more talent to go into the smaller cities. I think the reason for on a business perspective, if you have lower budgets or if you are getting larger accounts and you want to save money and get more profit, going to smaller cities makes sense, right? The tax deductions, the money that you can save or retain on the business level is a great incentive than, of course, the large rent and all of the taxes in New York or the larger cities. From a talent perspective, though, it just makes sense. I'm from South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina. I moved up to New York because, of course, I thought it was the mecca of marketing and advertising, and it is. But when I went home, as my agency is digital, I went home for a few weeks. I just felt calmer, right? It's the idea that smaller cities allow you to have a true work-life balance. They allow you to actually maybe have shorter commutes, spend less money on expenses, so you can save money, you can buy or purchase property. And I think from a talent perspective, that's very intriguing. I think in New York, the city itself can get very large and can encompass someone. It creates a sense of angst itself, right? Being New York, this big giant, or any larger city. And so for talent and especially creatives, smaller cities allow you to breathe. It allows you to continue to do the great work that you want to do now on the larger accounts that you are interested in, because these agencies are embracing smaller cities. So I think it's definitely beneficial. We're thinking about work-life balance here. We're thinking about getting the best story and the best creative work. I think for, of course, the larger cities, it begs the question, how can they reinvent themselves to become or continue to be a mecca of storytelling or creativity or culture that drives people's interest in staying in the city and sacrificing some things that they don't get at smaller cities?
These are all good points, and they definitely reflect a lot of my own thoughts about the smaller markets. I mean, the smaller markets offer a lot more advantages to a talent who's looking for a better work-life balance. But at the same time, I think that this situation is going to face the same problem that a lot of award shows face. And I think that's a nice segue over to Tim, because, one of the things about award shows that I discovered being on an award show board for a number of years is that we were always losing out to Cannes because Cannes was in the south of France. It was a destination. There was a reason, kind of a shining pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Like, you might go to south of France for a week and party up with the elite who go there. So there's a certain cachet with the destination and the location, and I think that's true with advertising as well. If you're not going to the big cities for your account, you're somehow, maybe not getting the most bang for your buck. You might not be getting the most, how can we say this politely, the most a wonderful business trip imaginable, as opposed to a little trip off to Kansas City. You're going to New York and you're catching a Broadway show. There's so much going on in the big city approach to advertising. I can't see why this is going to be a real challenge to the dominance of the major markets. How about you, Tim? What do you think?
Well, I don't know if I should answer the Cannes question. I think Cannes being in the south of France is a good reason to go to an award show that's in New York. But no, I mean, listen, talent. If you're 20 years old and you're graduating from college, of course you're going to want to go to New York or LA or San Francisco. I mean, I did that at 22, and I did it. I was in New York for 14 years, but. I do think there's a shift happening. I do think that younger folks, do want that quality of life probably sooner than we used to, and I do think Portland. I keep bringing up Portland, but it's the example that's in front of me every day. I mean, my jobs have always been tethered to New York, first with Adweek, now with Clio. But if you look at the talent coming to Portland, they are coming here younger. Some of them are not leaving. They go to Mecca here and they want to stay because there's a more thriving scene here. I moved to Portland 10 years ago, and there was very little going on then. Now the creative culture has really taken root here. I mean, there's a wonderful restaurant scene, and the smaller markets, I think many of them have more to offer young people now. And young people, they're more willing to, they're more interested in having the balance, and they're less interested. I think maybe they'll go to the big city for a while, but I think. Once they've gotten some experience under their belt, they want to go to a city that has more to offer, where you don't have to, there's more reasonable rents, and they can get married and not have to worry about, trying to make it work in the city, which is just, New York's ridiculous. A good example here in Portland is the agency Via. They're an agency, the highest profile agency in Portland. They've had national clients over the years. But I think they're just reaching a new tier now. You know, they recently won the LL Bean account, which is obviously being Maine based. They were craving that account for 25 years, and they've had it. You know, they've gotten it now. And you know, you can sense the you know that you don't have to go to Boston even, or you don't have to go to New York if you're in Portland. And I think many of the smaller cities around the country are feeling that. And I think it is beneficial. You know, I think as the country grows, as population grows, the so-called second tier markets are going to become more top tier. And instead of it being, you know, a few cities that do good advertising, I think you're going to have dozens doing good work.
Jonathan, do you concur with all this? You're a big city guy as well, aren't you? I mean, it's just like you're based in Chicago.
Yeah, no, and what was John Dillinger's quote? Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is.
Yeah.
You know, I did the same thing Tim and Darren did. I mean, I after college, by the way, in Waterville, Maine. Thank you very much.
Nice.
I went to New York for 8 years because that's where the jobs were and that's where the energy was. But I'd look at this question answer differently. Instead of looking at quality of life, I would for the creator, I'd look at the experience of life of the consumer, because the days when New York and LA to a lesser extent, and London for that matter, could dictate advertising and branding strategy for big brands were the days of mass media and command and control communication. So arguably, it was reasonable to believe that your average consumer in Kansas City or Austin or all these secondary markets that are now getting hip and fun had to kind of were willing to follow the lead of the creative conceits created by people in New York. Or Chicago, because that's how media worked. But now I'm not so certain that 20-something creative living in New York has really much of anything in common with his or her counterpart living in Austin or Kansas or Des Moines or anywhere else. They don't; those consumers don't have to obey the dictates of the lifestyle and the experience of that city, that urban dweller. I think to the innovation front, again, to the first conversation, on the technology side, you know, that's why your smartphone options are full of things for making city life easier, right? You can order cupcakes and cabs and hotel rooms and clothing and whatever else. And the reality is that to the vast majority of Americans, it's irrelevant because the designers of those tools live in a certain environment that has no relationship to the environment the rest of the country or the world lives in. So I would suggest that shift is not only about quality of life. And by the way, I run a 30-person agency and it's completely virtual. So I got bodies all over the world. And in fact, I don't even know where most of them are most of the time. And it doesn't matter because one, I want staff immersed in the lives of the customers we're talking to. And secondly, you know what? That trip to New York to go to the Broadway show with the client is a flight away. It's it's an overnight trip for me from Chicago. It really doesn't matter. I don't have to live there to lay on the schmooze. So I would argue that the shift is bigger than just quality of life. It also has to do with the changing nature of how brand and brand creators need to relate to their consumers. And in that sense, the shift to secondary or tertiary markets is probably a good thing.
But do you think the brands are smart enough to get that reality as opposed to just focusing on the fact that I'm a big brand spending $4 billion a year in media or whatever my budget happens to be, and I can get everything I need in one place. I can meet with my 3 agencies because my 3 agencies are all in the New York metro area in one trip. I don't have to scatter my services to the winds. From a standpoint of just pure efficiency in managing your brand and your agencies, doesn't it make sense to focus on, if you're a big brand, on focusing in a big shop in a big market?
No.
It doesn't make any sense?
No. Go ahead.
It does, I think because I think it's
Darren,
because you also just give away that idea of what we were talking about of being innovative, right? And being innovative within different regions. And what we push at Bold Culture a lot of the times is being within your being contextually understanding of the markets and your audiences. And if you have varied audiences, it's great to have different agencies in different places. An agency in Atlanta being able to connect to people in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida would possibly do better than someone in New York who's just thinking, oh, this is what people in Georgia do, or this is what people in Florida do, right? You have that context, you have an understanding that nuance is understood to do better advertising, and to impel or compel more people to buy your product. But at the same time, it's also from a larger brand perspective, a big shift, right? Which is why the industry is now talking about it. And I'm very sure that brands are going to start to listen, but it may take a longer time to do it. I think the smart brand, the innovative brand, as we've been talking about, would get on that right now, and start to see how they can operate it and control it in a way that it's beneficial to its consumers and to its product.
Well, another way that a lot of agencies are having to deal with the changing reality of today's world is the fact that the union talent that they work with is becoming increasingly upset with the ways that the agencies are dealing with their union contracts. Agency BBH has become the latest shop to break ties with SAG-AFTRA, which is the big acting talent union for all films and television. Tim, this situation stems in large part from the never adequately addressed situation over royalties for digital usage. I mean, basically the union contract still stipulates that royalties must be paid for every usage, and that makes the ad potentially so expensive that it can't actually be executed in market. So is the industry being unfair to acting talent, or is the union just not recognizing a core problem with their current contracts? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a labor question, a pretty serious one, and a pretty complicated one. But at the core, I think you can
But of
understand
course,
both
you can
sides.
figure it out for us. We're absolutely 100% behind you. We're all willing to take whatever your lead is and follow it forever. So you just go ahead and tell us
All
how we
right,
solve this problem.
excellent.
Praise
long as-
Tim. Praise Tim.
As long as SAG doesn't get too upset with me for saying the following. No, I think you can understand the motivation for both sides here. The union wants to protect its members and keep their wages and the working conditions high. The agencies are increasingly need to rein in the production costs. They're under great stress from the clients to cut their budgets to do more with less. And I think a big part of that, not speaking specifically about any agency, is to have the flexibility to work with non-union talent on some jobs. And as you say, now that there's more and more digital channels, there's more and more content that's needed to fill those channels, and you have to produce that at lower budgets. So yeah, I mean, it keeps coming up. And so you've got agencies like BBH wanting to get out of the deal with SAG. You have agencies that were started in the last 5, 10, 15 years that were never signed the contract in the first place. An agency like Droga5 comes to mind. They were actually the target of an attack campaign by SAG a couple of years ago.
And that was really effective, right? I mean, that was not effective at all. The Droga 5
no, it wasn't very effective.
Right.
Because I think Droga was acting faithfully whenever they were hiring talent. And SAG has tried to deal with the inadequacies of its own contract as well. They've created a couple of waivers. One called the low budget digital waiver, which allows union talent to work on some productions that are made just for digital or social media, even if the wages in some cases don't stack up to what's specified in the main SAG contract. So yeah, I mean, I think you've got two sides that just have these competing but somewhat valid reasons for doing this. I think the hard part for us is to know where actual abuses might be happening. I mean, BBH, if you read their statement on this, it's very, very broad. If you listen to SAG, SAG's got a very aggressive. They use a lot of shaming language to talk about the agencies that they start fights with or have fights with. So I don't know. I mean, I think one thing I will say is I think the ad industry does have a history of treating acting talent, particularly non-celebrity acting talent, as kind of marginal to the creative process. If you hire a celebrity, that's one thing. That's great. Like that contract is hammered out separately, and obviously you have no worry that the celebrity is not going to be paid properly. But for non-celebrity actors, they're very rarely recognized. I mean, I don't know. I've published thousands of stories about creative campaigns, and almost never maybe one time out of 1,000 do they actually even list the acting talent. So, I mean, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're treating them poorly or illegally, but I think it does maybe suggest that actors aren't, at the top of the list of priorities among agencies, as they're under, this tremendous financial pressure to deliver video work for clients. So I think it's a difficult. I think both sides have a point, and I'm not sure how it plays out, honestly.
Darren, any thoughts on this? I mean, do you see a way out for the agencies that is advantageous for both the agency and the union to get satisfaction out of a contract, or is there just no way to bridge this gap because of the intractability over the issues at large?
I think that there's always a solution that can happen, but given the factors, there's just a lot of hard conversations that need to be had, right? And possibly not. I don't know.
No, it's fair enough, because
for me,
this problem is
I'm not
really
sure.
complicated. I mean, it's just like
Yeah.
it's not an easy problem, but I mean, from a standpoint of whether or not the talent deserves to be recognized, whether the talent deserves to have a royalty, whether or not the talent deserves to have a royalty at the level that they've been expecting. All these issues have been on the table for, tell me, Jonathan, I mean, it's got to have been for the past 20 years now, since the dawn of the internet age, we've been dealing with this issue, right? I mean, why is it that it's so hard to figure out what the talent, basically where the give and take is, and is the stalemate? Is the problem belonging to the agencies, to the talent and the unions, or is it firmly on the clients who's squeezing every dollar out of every ad campaign and not really wanting to pay for everything that it costs to make?
Yeah. So Bob, I think the answer is yes and yes.
I'm glad
so
you got a
from
question out of that, because I barely managed to form that.
Well, so I agree with Darren. I mean, I don't think there's an answer, and Tim for that matter. I mean, I don't think it's a very complicated issue, but I want to make 2 points. One, on a technical level, it's a much bigger problem than the ad industry and talent, right? It's this idea of not only rights and copyright on the internet, but actually labor rights and wage activism. And this is a battle that has been going ebbing and flowing for not just the past 20 years, but for ever since the Industrial Revolution, right? So on one level, corporate procurement, the folks who own the capital, not to speak like a total communist here, but they're going to cut whoever is going to let themselves get cut. So there is no righteousness. It's not right. It's not wrong. It just is. And at a technical level, there is an argument to be made that, hats off to the union for defending and asserting its rights for as long as it possibly can, because there is no good reason why they should give it up in lieu of another cost being cut. I mean, it's all at some level reasonably arbitrary. The second issue, though, the second level isn't so arbitrary, and that is, and this is really building on Tim. As Tim was talking earlier on, my head was kind of blown up here, because I really started thinking about brands differently. Really, I mean, fundamentally, and it's really I don't want to belittle it. I mean, really a big aha, and that is, if branded communication is really about entertainment and about what's latest and greatest and what's real time and what engages consumers, arguably we have a vision, a paradigm shift of marketing and branding as being not so much about selling a product or service, but really just purely engagement and entertainment and propagating content into the cosmos. And as such, we have a transition going on here from agencies being sellers of product and services to really publishing or movie production studios creating entertaining, engaging content that gets customers teed up so that they can be sold to. So if that vision is correct, if that paradigm shift is accurate, then what's underlying this argument is a lack of vision about the role that talent plays in this equation, right? Because no longer are you simply a prop in a sales message. That actor or actress is actually talent in a piece of entertainment content, no different from a movie or a TV show or a song. And as such, a different set of rules should apply. It's
And
not you're a piece.
Yeah,
right?
That's really interesting. I think though you have to remember that this is commercial acting, and it's everything that the weight of that, all the way people think about that plays into this as well, right? There's even actors themselves say, it was just a commercial that I was in versus a show or a movie. I think their commercial acting talent is treated sort of like second class talent often, and I think that is a shame. And I do think that your point is great, that when as advertising and marketing shifts to become way more similar to entertainment, that the acting probably it will fall to the actors to make it believable.
Well, because the same thing happened. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the same thing happened to authors. Like William Thackeray writing Vanity Fair got paid crap for the episodic installments of that what became a novel, right? Because people thought about it differently. It was just a different work product. It was a different output, creative output, which was just worth less. He just didn't deserve to get paid as much as Charles Dickens was getting paid for writing. Well, no, I guess he did it episodically too, but whatever. I'm getting my history screwed up. But whatever happened later, novelists got paid in a different scheme. And I think that both the agencies and the talent kind of need a reset about what the conversation's really about and what is the negotiation about.
Absolutely. They need to stop thinking about this as being a commercial talent contract, and they need to start thinking about the ongoing value of creating digital content and how that plays into their own careers. I mean, there is opportunity here that didn't exist prior to the current market that exists right now, and it's just like the unions need to go back to the bargaining table with a whole different set of priorities, and they need to realize that yes, this cheap digital content is not worth our time or our effort or our ongoing concern about our members. We need to be focused on this much richer contractual negotiation with people about these content opportunities that you're describing, Jonathan. Darren, you were going to say something?
Yeah, what I'd add, it just comes to my mind about the influencers, or particularly diverse influencers online, who are also producing the content, right? They're thinking about the content they're creating it for the agencies, and then they're just giving it up for, and this isn't go for SAG, but they're giving it up for less than $1,000. Sometimes they're now just getting their value. And so the idea, I think, with any representation is, as brands start to invest more into digital and media companies start to push more content, how are the influencers going to be paid not only for the work that they do on camera, but behind the camera as well, to make their agencies look good for the brands that they're working for, right? We've seen it with some of the media companies that we work with, and they create content, and many times it's undervalued, it's rushed, and it's sometimes no credit. And I think that would speak to a larger portion of how we go into contractual agreements and what representation means in changing that theory.
Well, we need to move on to our final topic real quickly, running out of time. Finally, we've known for some time that fear of missing out was a powerful driver in advertising, as we call it FOMO in the marketplace. But new research seems to suggest that millennials are much, much more susceptible to such tactics than the rest of the market. So, Jonathan, how can we best leverage this fact, and what are the limits to this? I mean, obviously, I can see an opportunity to create FOMO with this particular market, but where do we draw the line on that?
Yeah, that's a really good one, right? Because it is somewhat of it shouldn't be, but it is somewhat of a thin line between motivation and passion and exploitation, right? Because not everything arguably is the latest, greatest must-have. And I wonder at some point if there's a chronological evolution here in that millennial consumer, and I have absolutely no data to back this up, but my gut tells me, don't you hate it, like when you have to make a point like that because you realize everybody just decides you're going to talk crap? But my gut tells me that these millennials are going to keep growing up, and at some point they're going to become less susceptible, and for that matter, actually reactionary and negative about being pushed for that next latest greatest thing and being left out. So I think the dividing line is one of those squishy value-based principles that you just hope that agencies and their clients will define properly, and that is, how do we feel about the difference between what's good to have versus what's must to have? Because if everything's an emergency, it's like that scroll on CNN, right? That's like special report, special announcement. It happens all the time. So what happens is that it loses all of its meaning, and I think it's a dangerous thing to pursue unless unless brands can just somehow figure out how to. I guess bottom line is I don't have an answer.
Well, I mean, you made a lot of good points for not having an answer, so kudos to you. But,
Thank you.
One of the things that struck me about this article that I was reading was that this is less about millennials and more about digital adoption and the kinds of platforms that we adopt. When we're talking about a millennial audience, we're talking about heavy social media usage in this particular marketplace. And, when you go younger, you find much more messaging platform usage. You go higher, you find messaging platform and email usage. But in this one section of the marketplace, you find a really heavy adoption of social media. And I'm wondering, but is this more about platform usage and the ability to see what your neighbors are doing and being able to play that keeping up with the Joneses game constantly? Because I know, the reason I make that distinction is I don't believe that it's just millennials who are susceptible to it, because I know lots of people in my age group who happen to be heavy social media users who are just as susceptible to FOMO.
Yeah, so I'd step in there as the resident millennial on the podcast at this point. I'd say that maybe there needs to be a connection of experience and social. We see it a lot with a lot of the pop-ups happening, of pop-up experiences happening in New York. Some have happened in Atlanta, and the best brands or newer brands have adopted the fact that people are on their phones, but they're also living life, right? So if you can connect both of those, then of course you'll get fear of missing out, and people will want to go to certain interactive museums. There was one at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., which was, I think, Shark House, if I'm getting their name right. And it was just an interactive art exhibit that people loved and they Instagrammed it. And so audiences and people, that increased. So what I would say is, of course, you want to adopt some social media usage, but you want to look at how can you use other mediums and other places to drive that fear of missing out, right? The fear of missing out is always about the experiences that people see on those social media platforms, not necessarily being on the social media platforms themselves.
I totally agree. I feel like it needs to be a much wider usage of media platforms in order to get the attention of the user. You can't just rely entirely upon social media, but I do believe that social media is the key driver here that has created this FOMO epidemic. I mean, there's
for sure.
There's absolutely no other factor
at first it was
play.
Word of mouth, I'm very sure. I mean, and someone talked about it, but when that's multiplied by billions on social media and with the internet, then you get this larger fear of missing out epidemic.
Well, with that, it's time for the Ad Fail 5. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Jonathan Baskin. You can find him at arcadialab.net. That's the home of Arcadia Media Lab. Tell me, what's going on in your world, Jonathan? What would you like to promote?
Well, Bob, I'm doing two content platform activities these days, and I invite anybody to come check them out. First, I've started a podcast on Pippa, and if you search for the brand Populist, I'm posting short audio essays on what it means for brands when customers start acting like their owners. And I'm exploring that idea. And I think there's probably a book in it somewhere there. So I'm actually just testing out content. The second is a blog I've been writing now for a while called Across of Silicon, which is about challenging notions about technology and specifically how we talk about technology and how there's a widening gap between what arguably it should and can do, or an understanding of what it should and can do, and what people really expect from it or are scared about it. So the Brand Populist and Across of Silicon are both content platforms, and I invite anybody to check them out. And please comment. I love conversation, and I will reply.
And that inspires me to dust off that blog I have called Death by Advertising, because I do have deathbyadvertising.com. I love that domain. I just need to do something with it. So inspirational what you've done for me. Next up, we have Darren Martin. You can find him at streamlinedmedia.co. That's with a C-O, not a com. So get that right. So tell us, Darren, what would you like to promote?
Yes, well, Bob, thanks again for having me on. And I'd like to promote Bold Culture today. Bold Culture works with brands and agencies to reach, resonate, and retain diverse talent and consumers. We do that by insights, reports, consulting, both on a talent level and marketing level, and connections also to talent and or influencers. And so you can check out some of our research and content at boldculture.co.
And Bold Culture is a fabulous consultancy, so you definitely want to check that out. And last but not least, Tim Nudd. You can find him at ClioAwards.com. That's easy enough. You also have a site for Muse, which I'll let you tell them about. But tell us, what would you like to promote, man?
Well, so yeah, today is, as we record this, the 9th of September, and it's the 2-month anniversary of Muse, which I launched on July 9th. And you can find it at musebyclio.com. And it's a new site all about creativity in marketing and sometimes beyond marketing. We're doing some really cool stuff. We're doing Q&As with creative people. We're delving into new campaigns, kind of some of the stuff I was doing at Adweek, just a little more in depth. And we're also running a series of really interesting essays about creativity from working creatives, people in the business, many of whom you've probably heard of, some you haven't. So check us out. We're pretty new, and if the first couple months are any indication, I think it's going to be pretty fun rest of the year. So it's musebyclio, CLIO.com.
Can't wait to check it out. And as for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. You can even find out how to advertise on the program, so check it all out at thebeancast.com. And don't forget, we now have transcription services, and that's provided through transcribeme.com. You can go to transcribeme.com/beancast for a special offer. They're giving it to our listeners as part of this promotion that they're doing, but they're giving me free transcription, and you get the benefit from it. So definitely check them out, transcribeme.com/thebeancast. And now it's time for the Ad Fail 5, a rundown of the lowest moments in advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. Now, first up, Apple's famed walled garden seems to have a snake in it, and that snake is a very large python indeed. The top-selling paid app on the App Store, or at least it was Adware Doctor. Apparently, this wonderful app stole a user's browser history, Jonathan, and sent it to China for whatever purposes it was supposed to be doing. Apple knew about the problem for several weeks, yet did nothing about it until just before this show. I hear they took it down off the App Store. So it's surprising to me that of all the places where this would happen, it happened on the App Store, because I can imagine something like this happening on the Android store very, very easily.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think it's your point, specific to Apple and Tim Cook's avowed commitment to not being an exploiter of privacy. To let this happen is shocking. But one word comes to mind: Foxconn. So companies are imperfect, and I actually am willing to, maybe because I drink the Kool-Aid on Apple, but I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, whatever process they had just simply broke down, and they missed this one. I'm willing to say I'm not going to read too much into it.
Well, next up, KFC is offering $11,000 in scholarship money, Tim. So get ready to be the first family to name your child Harland if that child is born on their founder, Harlan Sanders' birthday, September 9th. That would be like today. So some poor kid now has the name Harland. I don't know. I mean, obviously they got a lot of attention for this, but it seems like they got a lot of mocking attention for this, which doesn't seem beneficial.
Well, it's the same thing, isn't it, when it comes to KFC work? I mean, Wyden's KFC work's always had a bit of self-loathing at the core, I think, as much as I admire a lot of their work, but I mean, Harland is a terrible baby name, and kudos to KFC for acknowledging that and having some fun with it. Not many brands would make fun of their founder in such an incredible variety of ways as KFC does.
Unless you're Papa John, right then it's completely fine. It's completely fine to make fun of your founder, but that's beside the point. Speaking of pizza, Domino's Russia severely underestimated their market's desire for free pizza here. I love this one, Darren. They offered 100 years of free pizza to anyone who tattooed the Domino's pizza logo on themselves. The 2-month promotion lasted only 5 days after the company was flooded with way too many submissions to make it economically possible to feed that much of Russia.
This always goes back to the first time I was on this podcast and we talked about Build-A-Bear, right? They just don't understand or don't learn from these free promotions. It's too many people will literally do crazy ideas. Just like calm that down a bit.
Yeah, you'd think you'd learn. It's just like the landscape is littered with stories exactly like this. It never works. Why aren't you listening?
Well, I think it's great press for them. I think that's a good story for them. So they'll figure out a way to accommodate.
Well, the Scottish Gin Society had its promotion pulled by the Advertising Standards Authority in Great Britain over a supposed lighthearted campaign that told your liver to shut up and that gin was the cure for incurable sadness. Jonathan, probably they should have checked those regulations on what can and can't be said in liquor advertising. I mean, I'm listening to this. I mean, it can't be that different in Great Britain over the United States in terms of liquor advertising. You can't say things like, this will solve your sadness. It just doesn't.
Right, or running full page ads saying, "Hey, opioid addicts, take more." I mean, it's just it's nonsense to me. I think of those. Wasn't there a whole series of movies, or no? It was a Twilight Zone episode where at the end the characters found out that they were marionettes, they were puppets.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
I think this idea of brand, whether it's the tattoos, whether it's go abuse your liver, whether it's 100-year, it's name your baby Harland. This is like consumer abuse. This is manipulation, and it's funny and it's engaging, but at some level it is really, to Tim's point, it's sort of self-loathing of these brands to do these things to their customers. It's like telling them, I know that you're stupid, but whatever, this is going to be okay because you bought into this collective hallucination. I just think it's just bad karma.
Visit the Scottish Gin Society at deathbyadvertising.com.
Hear, hear.
And last but not least, gay dating app Scruff, Darren, has pulled all programmatic ads from its platform, citing data security as being impossible to maintain with the available programmatic platforms that were out there on the market. This one, on its surface, seems like it's a simple story, but it's basically saying there is not a single programmatic platform out there that will keep their data safe and keep their users in good shape.
I'm not dealing with it with Scruff, but definitely for some of our media partners that we're working with, we just get some crazy interstitial pop-ups that come up. I won't name one huge advertiser who has it the worst, but they just did a larger merger. And I don't know. It's just, for me, we've completely cut down our programmatic advertising stack, and we only work with one or two because of this issue. It's just too much. You don't know what the ad security is, the data security, and they also want too much information just in the contracts that they send us to sign. So kudos to Scruff for that.
Yeah, kudos to them. And all you out there, if you have something to add to this list or just want to discuss it, comment online, use the hashtag AdFail5. That's pound, AdFail, and the number 5. Well, that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an iTunes listener, we've also provided a direct link to the iTunes Music Store, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory of iTunes. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
You know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. Just like, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know. Like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.